music.
Mama, 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 yeah. 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 Mama, 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 yeah.
Jelo mama, gifuno gubu yele kaya.
Mama, yeah.
Jelo mama, lumendo, ansaufu.
Mama, yeah.
La moya wa mutabugile.
Mama, yeah.
Nenhliziyo yami ibuhlungu.
Mama, yeah.
Funa ukubuyela ekhaya.
Ozangane,
Uyangishaya.
ozekhaya.
Ngiyesaba mama.
Ozangane,
uzongibulala.
ozekhaya.
Akulathando.
Ozangane,
Lapha ekhaya.
ozekhaya.
Uzangibulala.
Ozangane,
Akangithandi.
oza. Mama, 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 yeah.
Mama.
Mama, mama, mama,
Mama.
mama, yeah.
Mama, yeah.
Mama, mama, mama,
Mama,
mama, yeah.
Mama,
Mama, mama, mama, mama, yeah.
ngifuna ukubuyela ekhaya.
Ozangane,
Ukubuyela ekhaya mina.
ozekhaya.
Ngifuna ukubuyela ekhaya.
Ozangane, ozekhaya. Ozangane, ozekhaya. Ozangane, ozekhaya. Ozangane, ozekhaya. Ozangane, ozekhaya. Ozangane, ozekhaya. Ozangane, oza. Mama, 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 yeah.
Mama.
Mama, 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 yeah.
Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today. We're so excited to be launching our One World Granny learning adventure today, and we're thrilled that you can all join us. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our technical wizards to you, Felicity Gerard and Marlene Best. And Marlene is going to give everyone a few guidelines about participating on Zoom. Thanks, Marlene.
Thanks, Diane. As you'll notice, you are muted and your video is off. You're in listen and view mode for the webinar. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions using the chat box later on in the program, just before and during the panel discussion. but we'd ask you not to use the chat box before then. And the webinar is going to be recorded, and you'll have access to that recording after the webinar. Back to you, Di.
Okay, thank you. So before we really get into our webinar, I'm going to tell you what we're going to be doing today. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today in Ottawa is on the unceded traditional territory of the Indigenous Algonquin peoples. So, and I would also especially like to thank Abbotsford Senior Centre for partnering with us in this educational pilot series. Welcome to the members of Abbotsford, as well as grandmothers in the Ottawa-Gatineau region. We also have representatives from granny groups in Toronto, Kamloops in British Columbia, and Sackville in New Brunswick. So we're right across the country today. Everybody joining us this afternoon. The wonderful African music that welcomed you today is by the female a cappella Nobunto group from Zimbabwe. They're wonderful. We just love everything they do. The webinar series is a pilot, education, and advocacy project hosted and created by the One World Grannies, one of 19 voluntary groups in the region that support the grandmothers in Africa. The One World Grannies also developed the One World Challenge with a virtual trek route that we will follow in this series through sub-Saharan Africa. The webinars will use the maps, resources, and information generated for the virtual trek, together with knowledge of the 15-year-long Grandmothers Movement, to tell you the true and fascinating story of the difference solidarity is making in the lives of sub-Saharan grandmothers and in our lives too. You have received an email package this week with some information and resources about the series and about the first webinar today, titled The Adventure Begins, Grandmothers on the Move. As Marlene has mentioned, the webinars are being recorded and will be available for anyone not able to join us on our scheduled dates. We do have a wonderful panel of grandmothers and experts to begin our journey. The panel will be facilitated by Peggy Edwards, a member of the One World Grannies, who has been involved with the Grandmothers Movement since its beginning 15 years ago. Today, we will learn about the Grandmothers Campaign and the One World Challenge trek through sub-Saharan Africa. We will explore the first 5 countries on our adventure with our excellent guide: Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we will share some great stories about grandmother solidarity. I'll hand over to Peggy now to introduce you to our panel members and to begin today's discussion. Peggy.
Thanks, Diane. It's such a pleasure to be here and welcome everyone. It's my job to introduce the panel members that we'll hear from today. And when they are finished presenting, to facilitate an interactive discussion with you. So as Marlene has mentioned, please use the chat box if you have comments or questions for the panelists. So we have 4 panelists today, and I'm going to introduce them all together rather than break it up. And our first speaker is going to be Mary Jane Stern. There she is. I see her on the screen. Mary Jane is a mother of 4 and a grandmother of 13. She co-founded the One World Grannies in 2006 after attending the Stephen Lewis Foundation's Grandmother Gathering in Toronto. Along with being treasurer, she's played many other roles within the movement over the last 15 years. She's been to Uganda and Kenya twice and has witnessed the impact of the Stephen Lewis Foundation projects firsthand. Before retirement, Mary Jane had a varied career, including social worker, psychology instructor, managing director of HR for an international high-tech company, and an organizational development consultant. Wow, quite a history. Mary Jane will speak to us about the Grandmothers Movement, its beginning, and some of the highlights in the last 15 years. Our second speaker will be Jenny Brooks. Jenny's worked in healthcare for 45 years as a critical care and emergency nurse, full-time faculty at Algonquin College, teaching a 2-year specialty program for RNs, and finally as a nurse practitioner for the last 15 years of her career. Since retirement 5 years ago, Jenny loves to spend time with family, grandchildren, and friends. Travel, cottage life, book club, a variety of outdoor activities, meditation, environmental advocacy, and her volunteer work with the One World Grannies and the Council on Aging, Consumer Time. So Jenny led the One World Challenge adventure, which we're going to be following, and she'll briefly describe that to us. Our third speaker, Valerie Swinton, there with that lovely African background. Valerie's been an active member of the One World Grannies since the group began in 2006. And she has visited 2 of the countries she will profile today. Val is a former librarian and has managed her own business in partnership with her husband, Noel. The One World Grannies are fortunate to have her skills and leadership in communications, particularly in the use of digital technology. Val helped build the One World Challenge website and monitored the progress of the campaign. And oh yes, her passion is tap dancing, which was her chosen activity in the One World Challenge trek. Val will talk about the first 5 countries we passed through on our trek. Our last speaker is Marjorie Court. Marjorie has been a participant in the Grandmother to Grandmothers campaign since its inception 15 years ago. During this time, she's been involved in a number of ways, for example, in co-developing a regional network of grandmother groups in the Ottawa area, a speakers bureau, and a training program for speakers. She's been co-chair of the One World Grannies group and an active participant in a variety of fundraisers and advocacy initiatives. The highlight of her involvements was a trip to Uganda, where she visited the PEFO project and met in person African grandmothers who were benefiting from the Grandmothers Housing Project funded by the Stephen Lewis Foundation. Never was there a warmer welcome. The strong bond between the African and the Canadian grandmothers was clearly evident and strengthened by the personal contact. Margie will tell us more about the PEFO project in Uganda. So thank you to all these wonderful, experienced panelists, and we'll turn it over to Mary Jane to start, please.
I'm delighted today to walk you through the highlights of the 15 years of the Grandmother to Grandmother campaign. 15 years ago, in 2006, sub-Saharan Africa had been ravaged by HIV and AIDS, and a whole generation was lost, resulting in millions of grandchildren homeless without anybody to care for them. Around this time, Stephen Lewis, who had been a special envoy for the UN AIDS in Africa, he had realized that it was the grandmothers who were holding the continent together. And he decided to do something about it. He thought there would be a lot of synergy bringing the Canadian and the African grandmothers together. So he established the Grandmother to Grandmother campaign. And a few months later, in August of that year, just before the International AIDS Conference in Toronto, he brought 100 grandmothers over from Africa to meet with 200 Canadian grandmothers for 3 days. Those 3 days were remarkable. We discussed in small groups the issues that the grandmothers face, besides their own grief at losing their children to HIV/AIDS. They were caring for grandchildren who were grieving also. They were challenged by poverty, challenged by feeding their children, housing the grandchildren, education. They themselves were not represented in terms of health care Many of them had HIV/AIDS, and because of the stigma, were not seeking treatment themselves. Next one. During these 3 days, it was a very emotional time. Despite all the challenges, however, it became really clear that these grandmothers were so resilient and so strong. Despite a lot of tears we shared together, we also shared a lot of laughter and a lot of dancing and singing. You really began to feel we Canadians were a little bit uptight as they broke into song and dance at the smallest provocation. It was wonderful and heartwarming. At the end of the 3 days, we marched. We marched the grandmothers in Canada and the African grandmothers with Stephen and Alana at the front. And at the end of the march, a Canadian and a African grandmother read a declaration. At the end of that, we all dispersed, of course. One thing I need to mention that was really moving, one of my most memorable times in the 3 days we were together is the first day they brought out lunch. And a few of the grandmothers were so upset because although they had left their grandchildren in someone else's care, there was no way they would ever see that much food in their lifetime. So it was a very moving and powerful experience for all of us. At the end of the conference, we all dispersed across Canada. And we said to ourselves, doing nothing is not an option. Next slide. So we began to form small groups. By the end of a year, I think we had about 150 groups across Canada. Most of us spent our first year just trying to get organized. What do? We knew we had 3 goals. We wanted to A, raise money. B, we wanted to educate ourselves and the communities on the situation in Africa. And 3, we wanted to be able to advocate. We struggled at first with our fundraising. A lot of us were, neophytes in that area, but eventually across Canada, you saw bake sales, bridge games, musicals, everything you could think of. And we also began to share ideas across Canada with the help and a lot of support from the Stephen Lewis Foundation. In 2007, this was a milestone for us in Ottawa. We decided that we were going to march. We were going to begin to raise awareness. So the Ottawa Grannies invited Stephen's replacement at the UN, Elizabeth Mataka, to come and join our march. And a little bit to our surprise, she accepted. Off she came, and she brought some grandmothers with her. And we had a really big turnout, and we marched on the hill, and the Grannies spoke, and we spoke. There were politicians who attended, but they didn't speak. And really, it ignited the movement for many of us, certainly here in Ottawa. Next slide. So then we began in earnest. And we moved from raising by year 2, we Grannies across the country had raised $2 million. Well, at the end of 15 years, we've raised $40 million. We got better and better. We shared ideas across the country, such things as bike rides. This is a group from out west. We also have a group in Ottawa that's rides usually 3 days, I think, and up to 100K a day, have raised thousands and thousands of dollars. Next. One of the groups in Ottawa climbed Kilimanjaro and raised almost $80,000. And I had to laugh. I was having coffee with a group 2 months ago, and one of the women was talking about, she was so proud of her husband, age 52, who was training to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And I thought, oh yeah? Well, what about our Grannies? They were amazing. Next one. We've also done, this is from Ottawa. In the Ottawa region, I have to say that maybe I'm biased. We have a wonderful region here. We have 19 groups right now. We work very closely together. We collaborate. We support each other's fundraisers. And one of the ones we've done for 5 years and been very successful is a marketplace where we've made a lot of money and made a lot of friends. And I have to say, across the country, we've even published, the SLF has published all sorts of documents where we can find out what other groups do. But the resourcefulness of the country has been really amazing. And to tell you a little bit about the groups, the beauty of the SLF is they are very supportive. Plus, we have a lot of freedom. The groups are all different sizes. Some meet bi-weekly, some meet in a month, some meet in town halls, some meet in homes. Some are small, some are large. We're a very diverse group. Our common bond is our love for our children, and if we have them, grandchildren, and our support of the African grandmothers. Next. So while we have grown, we Canadian grandmothers over the last 15 years, we've grown as fundraisers, we've grown as speakers, we've grown as advocates. The African grandmothers over these 15 years have grown also. Starting in about 2010, they began to march in Swaziland, in South Africa, Tanzania. And every time they've marched, they've drawn grannies from a few countries around them. They have become very powerful advocates and lobbyists in their own countries. They have taken the little projects that they started with our support, and they have grown them to, and Marjorie will talk about, to very expansive projects. They have become more confident. They feel supported. And it's been amazing to watch them as they grow and change over the 15 years. I should also say that a number of us across Canada have numerous opportunities to meet them. The SLF has brought them over to Canada 2 or 3 times. There was a caravan of a few grandmothers that went across the country. They brought them over. We had a tribunal in Vancouver where grannies from across Canada sat and heard powerful stories of 5 African women with various challenges. So we have a personal bond with these women also. And as far as our growth, well, we have all learned new skills. For our group, fundraising was a challenge at first, but we've become really good at it. We've also become really good advocates. We have met with government people. We have spoken across the country. We have spoken at churches. We have signed petitions. We have grown in ways we didn't expect. This is our One World Granny group. If I look at the impact on us as grannies, I know I'm speaking for our group, but I'm sure I speak for most granny groups across the country. This has been such an enriching experience. At an age when most people are, their world is narrowing, ours is expanding. We've made new friends, not just in our group, not just in our cities, but across the country. We've learned new skills. We've pushed ourselves. We've made lifelong friendships, and we're very committed to what we do. And what's very important for us is we have a lot of fun. And I think if we look back over the 15 years, what we've got is a long-term bond. We are in it for the long term. And I know our group talks about that a lot. When sometimes we seem to be too busy or we have pressure, we stand back and say, okay, we're volunteers, but we're in here for the long term. We've made a commitment. We said we would not rest until they can rest. One thing I'd like to do, if I have enough time, is I would like to read a statement from the grandmothers. It's not too long. At the end of the Solidarity March in 2006, the grandmothers created their own statement. And I just went through that whole book that we published after that. And it brought back so many memories. But I would like to read what they said because it's so true and it's so relevant now. And I also want to preface before I read it is, one of the things that we appreciate as grandmothers with the SLF model is it's not a charity model, it's a partnership. Stephen Lewis and Alana were so respectful of the grandmothers. They recognize that the grandmothers know what needs to be done. They know how to organize themselves. They know what to do. What they do need is money. They need financial help and support. So this is the statement. As grandmothers from Africa and Canada, we were drawn together in Toronto for 3 days by our similarities and our deep love and devotion to our children and our grandchildren, and our profound concern about the havoc that HIV/AIDS has inflicted on the continent of Africa, and in particular on its women and their children. And our understanding that we have within us everything needed to surmount seemingly insurmountable obstacles. We are strong, we are determined, we are resourceful, we are creative, we are resilient, and we have the wisdom that comes with age and experience. We will not raise our grandchildren for the grave. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary Jane. Oh my gosh, that was powerful and emotional. And your commitment and the commitment of the other grandmothers comes through so beautifully. Thank you for that. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Brooks to tell us a little bit about the One World Challenge.
Hi, everyone. My role is to chat with you about the One World Challenge, a virtual online fundraising event that was conceived last fall and ran between May 1st and September 1st of this year for a total of 4 months. It all began with the very sad announcement that our grand market, what Mary Jane had spoken about, and was our One World Grannies major fundraiser, would have to be canceled due to COVID. No gatherings allowed. I'm sure you're all too familiar with this refrain. We wondered how we could ever replace the market in terms of the dollars it raised, the fun we had, and the number of regional groups it involved. We began to brainstorm. Someone said, let's walk across the bridge. Someone else said, let's walk across Canada. And finally, someone said, let's walk across Africa. We could virtually trek through the 15 countries where the Stephen Lewis Foundation has a presence and runs community projects. The One World Challenge, uniting grandmothers in Canada and Africa with a hop, skip, and a jump, was born. We invited all 16 regional grandmother groups to join us. 8 chose to do so, which along with our own One World Granny group, gave us a total of 37 participants. The One World Challenge asked each of these 37 participants to choose any activities that they would like to do between May and September. Then they were to ask friends and family for a one-time online donation to support them to do so. All proceeds went directly to the Stephen Lewis Foundation Grandmother to Grandmother campaign. Any activity counted: walking, cycling, gardening, swimming, dancing, anything but sleep counted to advance our journey. So each 1 hour of activity advanced our journey by 5 kilometers. So if I rode my bike for 1 hour, I advanced our journey by 5 kilometers. From Addis Ababa, Ethiopia to Cape Town, South Africa. Our total number of activity hours were sent to Val every 2 weeks, and Val plotted our progress on the map. The distance we had to trek over the 4 months was 10,174 kilometers, a distance which seemed insurmountable when we first started. Our biggest challenge was to develop a web-based platform to support this fundraiser, a platform that would educate participants and donors about the Stephen Lewis Foundation, the Grandmother Movement, and the community-based projects in each of the 15 countries that we were to trek through. None of us had this expertise. Enter Val Swinton and her brother and her son-in-law, Mark Mahoney, who created our beautiful One World Challenge site, which you can see in your package of handouts. Our goal was to raise $25,000. Since we couldn't gather in person for the usual type of launch on May 1st, we decided to make a video, which would be sent to all participants on our May 1st launch day. So for the next 3 minutes, you will be watching this May 1st video. You'll be listening to a female cappella group from Zimbabwe called Nubuntu, the same music you heard as you were admitted to this webinar. In the background, their music fuses soul-stirring sounds, traditional African instruments, and joyful dance. So let's roll the cameras.
Rune moyo murefu, rune moyo munyoro, harune godo, harune manyawi, haruzvikudzi, runogara narini, 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 narini. Narini, 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 zvisingafaniri, haruzvitsvagiri zvaro, harutsamwi, haruna zvisharu, runotenda zvese, rune tariro pazvose, runogara narini, 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 narini. Narini,
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was wonderful, very inspiring, and thank you for your leadership in the One World Challenge. Jenny will need to leave us. She has a medical appointment that she needs to go to, but if you do have questions or comments about the One World Challenge, other members of the panel will be happy to answer them. So thanks again. Now moving on to our third speaker, and we've been waiting for this one. Val has taken on the big task of, oops, thanks. Val has taken on the big task of giving us a very brief snapshot profile of the first 5 countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So over to you, Val.
Hi, everyone. My challenge today is to fly you through 5 African countries in 10 short minutes. So please fasten your seatbelts. First, a brief note about Africa's history. In 1885, European and American leaders met in Berlin to divvy up the African continent. This was done without consideration for local history, laws, and ethnicities. Those arbitrary borders exist to this day. The result was a mixture of diverse cultures in each African country, so it should be no surprise that slicing up the African pie led to many internal conflicts. Common to all 5 countries is a heavily rural population that survives primarily on subsistence farming. However, urban centers ranging from Kenya's Nairobi with a population of nearly 5 million to Rwanda's Kigali with a population similar to Ottawa's, just over 1 million. Breathtaking landscapes and a deluxe diversity of wildlife are found in all 5 of these countries. And so to begin, traveling north to south, I'll start with a few highlights about Ethiopia. Ethiopia's topography includes spectacular highlands with peaks over 14,000 feet, large plateaus, deep river canyons, and rolling fertile plains. Agriculture is the backbone of the economy. Coffee, which is native to Ethiopia, was first exported in the 1800s and remains Ethiopia's main export. In fact, a coffee ceremony is a daily occurrence to show respect, friendship, and a warm welcome to others. There are many historical sites to explore. Ancient rock-hewn churches testified to the long practice of Christianity, which dates to 350 Common Era. Today, a majority of the population is Christian, while a third follow Islam, primarily the Sunni tradition. Ethiopia is the oldest independent country in Africa and one of only 2 countries, along with Liberia, that was not colonized by European nations in the late 1800s. The monarchy, which lasted from the 13th century to 1974, claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The last monarch, Emperor Haile Selassie, attempted to modernize the country, introducing Ethiopia's first written constitution and abolishing slavery. But he was overthrown in a 1974 military coup. Sadly, for the past year, a conflict between the government of Ethiopia and forces in its northern Tigray region has thrown the country into turmoil, leaving many dead and hundreds of thousands living in famine conditions. Recently, the government has even suspended some non-governmental organizations, including Doctors Without Borders, from working in the country and has expelled UN officials. On to Kenya. Kenya's landscape and biodiversity are absolutely spectacular. Most Kenyans live in the highlands, where Nairobi, a city of 4.5 million, sits at an altitude of 5,500 feet. Kenya's central highlands are among the richest agricultural regions in Africa. To the west of Nairobi lies the Great Rift Valley, where hominid bones as old as 6.2 million years proved that Africa, not Asia, was the birthplace of the human race. I visited Kenya in 2011 with a group of grandmothers, and I'll share some of those experiences with you. We visited Kazuri Beads, a workshop in Nairobi that provides employment for the disadvantaged, especially single motherhood women. Their ceramic hand molded and painted jewelry was a successful fundraiser for the One World Grannies for many years. We also visited a Maasai village where we were warmly welcomed by the women of the village, dressed in their finest. We greeted one another smiling and standing in a mixture of mud and cow dung. Then the men treated us to a jumping competition, dancing, and showed us how to start a fire using nothing but sticks. One of them, at just 17, was highly respected because he had already killed 3 lions, an initiation into manhood, armed only with a spear. Uganda. Churchill called landlocked Uganda the Pearl of Africa. Most of the country sits on a rainforest plateau ringed by mountains and valleys. Part of Lake Victoria, the world's second largest freshwater lake, after our own Lake Superior, lies within Uganda's borders and is the source of the mighty Nile River. If your interest is gorillas, you'll want to know that half of the world's surviving mountain gorillas live in a Ugandan national park. Uganda graduated from British protectorate to independence in the early 1960s. The country then experienced turbulent times that impeded economic development. However, in the 1990s and early 2000s, the economy, aided by foreign investment, improved rapidly. While the country has won praise for its vigorous campaign against HIV and AIDS, punitive laws and stigma against gays, sex workers, and drug users mean that the most vulnerable populations are least likely to seek the services they need. Our group of grandmothers visited Uganda as well as Kenya. While there, we visited a school in rural Uganda and helped with the breakfast program, which consisted of a cup of cream of wheat and a cookie. We looked in on the schoolroom, mud floor, and very basic, as you can see from the photo, and celebrated with the children in their new uniforms that were provided by a small Ontario NGO who organized our trip. On to Rwanda. Called the land of 1,000 hills, Rwanda's landscape is reminiscent of a tropical Switzerland. Its dominant feature is a chain of rugged volcanic mountains that runs along the country's west and northwest borders. A tapestry of rolling hills, savanna, plains, and swamps provide habitat for a diversity of animals and a bird lover's paradise of more than 600 species of birds. The name Rwanda still evokes memories of the horrific genocide that brutalized the country for 4 years in the early 1990s. Since then, Rwanda has undergone reconstruction and ethnic reconciliation and is striving to rebuild its economy. In spite of being one of the world's least developed countries and a civil war that devastated the healthcare system, Rwanda's strong HIV strategy has stabilized infection rates at just 3%. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, is the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa. Sitting astride the equator in Central Africa, it is one of the most resource-rich nations in the world. Even before its colonization by Belgium, the Congo provided the world with ivory and rubber. Since independence in 1960, the desire for minerals such as cobalt, diamonds, and copper, war, and authoritarian rule have contributed to making it one of the poorest nations in the world. With rainfall up to 80 inches a year in some areas, the Congo is dominated by vast tracts of rainforest, a rainforest second only in size to that surrounding the Amazon. The Congo is also known for its art and music. Congolese wooden mask sculptures are found in museums around the world and are known to have influenced trends in modern art such as Cubism. So that ends your jet speed trip through the first 5 countries of the One World Challenge trek with a very few facts, but I'm very happy to have taken you on that journey. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Val. That was fascinating. I just want to go and visit these countries right now, right away. Wonderful. And you rose to the challenge of 10 minutes so well. Thanks again. Next up, and our last speaker is Marjorie Court, who's going to talk to us about a project that she visited. So over to you, Marjorie.
Thanks, Peggy, and hello, everybody. 10 years ago, I had the good fortune to travel to Kenya and Uganda with a group of Canadian grandmothers. We had been able to get permission from the Stephen Lewis Foundation to visit the PEFO program, which at that time had been in existence for about 10 years in Jinja, Uganda. I have chosen to talk about this particular program because it's such a good example of what is made possible by the Stephen Lewis Foundation funding model, in which local leaders become partners with the Stephen Lewis Foundation and are supported to develop and utilize existing skills within their communities. The origins of the PEFO program really began over 30 years ago when Justine, Richard, and Robertson Ojambo, 3 brothers, lost their beloved mother Phoebe to AIDS, a common story. Their mother had always impressed upon them the importance of getting an education. And luckily, after she died, they were able to attract the support of a Dutch missionary who supported them to complete their education. The boys excelled and all of them completed university. The brothers could have stayed in Europe, but they came back to Uganda to work with impoverished rural women and children. In 2003, the brothers founded the Phoebe Educational Fund for AIDS Orphans, PEFO, in their mother's name. Justine would say, in serving others, we are remembering her. The PEFO program started modestly by obtaining funding for a microfinancing project. Women could apply for a $60 loan to start their own businesses. And when we were visiting the project, we got a little tour of what some of those projects were. And I have a few images that I'll just quickly show you. Slide. So clearly this is not one of the grandmothers. This is actually Justine. And he's showing us some coffee beans that are being grown and will be dried for sale. Next slide. And here's one of the many gardens that we saw. It's produce being raised for sale. Next slide. And here's some livestock. These are some goats. And the next slide, you'll see some pigs. And the thing that I remember so clearly about this barn was how incredibly clean it was and how healthy the animals were. Clearly this project was being highly valued by the people that were running it, and they were taking really good care of those animals. So fast forward to today, that microfinance project has become self-sustaining as a saving and lending cooperative. PEFO currently has 364 grandmothers being supported by the Older Persons Saving and Lending Cooperative, and 60 families are being supported through their farming projects. Next slide. Justine never lost sight of his commitment to education for AIDS orphans. PEFO set up self-esteem clubs for the children, paid for school fees, uniforms, and food at school. Slide. PEFO has also organized mobile clinics to make healthcare and medications accessible and affordable for grandmothers. PEFO has developed a partnership with the Jinja District Health Department, just as the SLF works in partnership with our African partners also create their own partnerships. And together, PEFO and the District Health Department are working to change hospitals and health workers' discriminatory attitudes towards treating the elderly. And these changes include changes in hospital policies and training for health workers. And I think I would like to invite this group to have a look at our Ontario nursing home system. Next slide. So here is a group of grandmothers at a seminar on human rights. Elderly Ugandans, particularly grandmothers, are seldom aware of their legal rights. Many of them don't read or write. Thus, they are often denied land and home ownership, health services, access to market opportunities, and access to mechanisms for reporting abuse to themselves and those under their care. So with the support of PEFO, there is now a Uganda Grandmothers Consortium. It's a collaboration among 6 community-based organizations. They offer advocacy and lobbying training programs. So they've developed a train the trainer program, and grandmothers are now feeling empowered to take charge of what's rightly theirs, to know what the law is and to know what they're entitled to. And they're spreading that word amongst other grandmothers. Next slide. So here I've listed all the different components of the PEFO program that have evolved over 20 years. You can see there's financial, it started with financial independence, education, health, human rights, and I'll talk about housing in a minute. You can see that these are all the basic essentials for healthy individuals and healthy communities. And all of these needs were identified by and addressed from within their own community. I have often heard, Alana used to say, and Stephen said it as well, the Africans don't need external experts telling them what they need. They know what they need. They just don't have the resources. They don't only know what they know what they need to do. So the last item on this list is housing, and I've saved it for the end because this is the part of the PEFO program that was funded by the SLF. In spite of the support provided for income and schooling, many grandmother-headed families were unable to function well because they lived in such poor housing. Particularly in the rainy season, families lived in fear of roofs caving in on them. In fact, just a few weeks before we arrived, there was a tragic death of a 4-year-old who had died when the roof of his home collapsed on him during the night. Next slide. So PEFO had applied to the Stephen Lewis Foundation and got funding for a diesel-operated brickmaking machine. Next slide. And here in the photo, you can see that it also provides employment for young men. Next slide. And here we have an abundance of bricks. Not only are there enough to build houses for the grannies, but they are selling them to other communities to do building. Next slide. And this one really demonstrates the impact of being able to build houses for grannies. Yeah. Since this program started, they have built 450 eco-friendly houses in rural Jinja. So that's my very quick overview of the PEFO program, which exists because 3 little AIDS orphans received the support they needed to complete their education and fulfill their mother's dreams for them. And I'm going to end my talk by letting Justine have the last word about what he thinks about the way the SLF provides funding.
It is very, very hard for community-based organizations to get funding for their activities. When they call for papers, they want already success stories, case studies, things that have already been proved. But sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you need to give people a chance to prove. For instance, when we started talking about housing for older persons in Uganda, everybody was laughing at us. Organizations that I went to said, Justin, you are not serious. We were saying grannies are poor, they need food, they need, I said, but they need a house. After the foundation gave us the opportunity, sponsored the houses, I can tell you that we proved, we showed the world that it works. And this is where the foundation has really performed so well. We are with the communities, we know what works, so we involve the people, but nobody wants to give us the opportunity to prove. But the foundation gives us the opportunity to prove. And everywhere now talk about housing. The other time I was reading in the papers, the president was saying, government is going to start building houses for older persons. Why? They have read about us and now everybody is taking it serious. But if the foundation had not given us the opportunity to prove ourselves, would we be able to convert these people? No.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. Very inspiring. A wonderful story of solidarity with the African grandmothers and the Canadian grandmothers and the strength and resilience. And as you said, they are the experts. We don't have to tell them what to do. They know what to do. We could learn a lot from that experience. Okay, the chat group is now open and we've had one message. Felicity and I will be monitoring the chat. This is your opportunity to make comments, perhaps about your experience in some of these countries we've looked at today, to ask questions. Please use the chat box now. And while we're waiting for some of that to come up, I have a question for Valerie. You did a wonderful job describing the 5 countries, and there were certainly some similarities. But I also noticed that each country is so unique. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm no African expert, and I've only visited 2 of the 5 countries. But yes, Saskatchewan is different from Ontario, and the Congo is going to be very different from Ethiopia. So what is common is that AIDS and now COVID have ravaged the continent, and the help that we gave grandmothers back starting in 2006 is just as important, if not more important today.
Well said. Okay. In the chat box so far, we've got nice congratulations and outstandings and thanks. Thank you to you. Do you have any comments or questions? And amongst the panel, do any of you have questions for each other?
I would just like to close the loop on the One World Challenge, because Jenny mentioned that we had set out to raise $25,000 and were astonished when everything was counted up at the beginning of September. I think we got very close to $53,000 from 38 people and their friends and their families supporting us doing every day whatever activities we had chosen. I just was gobsmacked at that result, and so wanted to mention how we did.
Great, great, thank you. And
We have a
Sorry.
comment in, is this Felicity here?
Yep.
We have a comment in the chat box from Maureen Murphy, who says, I was lucky enough to visit the PEFO project in 2010 and see houses, pigs, and to photograph 56 grandmothers, a life-changing experience. This meeting today has brought back wonderful memories and wishes to do more. And also from Ginny Clyfield, she asks, hello, may I have the means of joining the group in Ottawa? Yes, of course. At the end of this, there will be information on how to join the groups.
Okay, is that going to be a slide, Felicity, or at the end of this webinar, or is
It's
that
at the end, it's actually at the end of the final webinar.
Yes, okay. But just in case Ginny and others are not going to be on that final webinar,
Yes.
maybe we could address this quickly. As was mentioned, there are some 14 groups in the Ottawa-Gatineau area.
Actually,
And,
19, Peggy.
19, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you. 19 groups in the Ottawa-Gatineau area. And if, yes, you're in Ottawa. So probably the best thing to do would be to contact Sandy London, who is the co-chair of the regional group, and she can give you directions as to the various groups and how you might join them. Now, Sandy London, you're in the chat box here. Can you post your email address? Okay, so we'll come back to that. But as I say, all of the groups are open to new members, and we would welcome you. The other thing I might add is that although we're called grandmother groups, not all of us are grandmothers. We're not all biological grandmothers. We have younger women. We have women who have not had children or grandchildren, and everyone is welcome. We're all in this together.
Okay, we have another question, in fact, from Sandy. She says, can you talk about, this would be a general question to the panel, could you talk about what has changed over the past 15 years in the Grandmothers campaign?
Maybe Mary Jane, you could start with that since you gave us the highlights of the history. What do you see has changed?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, for the grandmothers themselves, they are so mobilized and energized, supportive, confident, working together more closely, not just within countries, across countries. You know, they've really moved the mark for themselves. I think for the Canadian grandmothers, one of the things that comes to mind is we're aging. When we started our group, Peggy, we were working, with 15 years ago, and we were younger and had more energy. And the reality is when you have a group that consists of grandmothers, so we have to get busy getting younger, recruiting younger people. So that's one thing that changed. But, we've all grown. We've all grown. I don't know, somebody else add, our relationship with the SLF has continued to be strong. It's interesting because now there are a lot of newbies from the SLF. They're losing a bit of their corporate memory because good news is they've been able to recruit, younger members, but we need to do the same. We're certainly a lot better at fundraising. We're certainly better informed, the grandmothers in Canada than we were. We're much more educated. I think we have a much better understanding than when we started. Somebody else add something?
I could add that, you know, in relationship to the aging and the time that we've been together, what I have noticed, certainly in our group, but I've talked to others all across the country, is that this whole concept of social support, which we had right from the beginning, but it has grown in importance. As you age, as you get older, the need for friendships and for social support grows. And the grandmothers movement and grandmother groups are a wonderful way to get that social support.
Absolutely.
Okay. Marjorie.
One of the things I've become aware of is the similarities between Canadian grandmothers and their relationships with their families, much the same as the African grandmothers and their relationships with their families. The details of the tragedies are different for sure, because we're not dealing with HIV/AIDS, but I've noticed when there's a problem in the family or some sort of catastrophe, it's often the grandmothers that are stepping in and looking after other members of the family. It's quite remarkable, actually. And as you said, Peggy, we've got that support now with each other as well. It's just new friends. A lot of us are saying, I never thought I'd be making such good new friends at this age. Close friends, new close friends. Yeah.
Yeah. Felicity?
We have some more messages coming into the chat box. Judy Bernstein says, inspiring. I had the opportunity to work in adult literacy in Cape Town through Algonquin College. Loved the positive attitude and music and dancing. How do we contribute? Can we be emailed joining and contribution information?
Absolutely. Diane will be sending out some more information following this webinar. So Diane, can we make a note of that in addition to the discussion today, let's add the information about how to contribute and how to join instead of waiting until the third webinar? Okay.
I think so.
Great. Thanks, Judy, for that comment. Nice to see you.
Janet Wilkinson would like to know, what plans do the One World Grannies, have for next year? Another trek?
Oh, good question.
Yes.
You want to take that one on?
Well, we're evaluating. We certainly can't do exactly the same trek through Africa, nor are we keen on going back to our same families and friends. So we've had a survey done, but we haven't analyzed the results yet. So stand by, and we're certainly hoping that the grand market will be on again in 2022.
Yeah, but you know, I think there's a great idea here, and there are some other there's some grandmother groups from across the country. Maybe you can look at the model of the trek and think about doing that in your areas. But we will be back to you on whether we do another trek. Okay, Sandy London, thank you. You've put in her email address, and if you're in the chat box, you can see it, but it's SAND@londonconsulting.ca. So that's SAND without the I at londonconsulting.ca. But as I said, we'll send some more concrete information to you about how you can join and contribute.
Okay, we just have a couple of minutes left. So I will read you this message from Nancy Burridge. She says, this is an extremely well done presentation, and I'm so glad to have been given the opportunity to be part of the audience. I can definitely see value in this as an educational and recruitment tool. Recruitment is an important need among many groups across the country. How great would this be as a tool? Thank you very much, Nancy.
Okay, so let's turn it back to Diane to wrap up.
Oh, Peggy, we have one correction on Sandy's email.
Oh, sorry.
It's SANDI, Sandy.
Okay.
at londonconsulting.ca.
Okay, I wondered about that when I saw it. So it's Sandy, her name, with an I, at londonconsulting.ca.
Yes.
Thank you, Sandy and Felicity. Okay, Diane, back to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. All those presentations were incredible. You really just have all captured something very special. Thank you very much. This brings our webinar to a close today, and I hope you've enjoyed the first part of our journey. And we're going to look forward to seeing you all next week, same time, same place on Zoom. And we'll continue our journey. We've got 5 more countries to visit and some wonderful panelists to educate us all. Our next date is Wednesday, October the 27th, starting at 1:30 again. And it's titled, "The Adventure Continues. Go, Grannies, Go." We'll email advance information plus the request that's been made and the Zoom link a couple of days in advance. And we'll end for today with some more wonderful music from Nobunto. Goodbye from me, for all the panelists for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Makandi tindi murambe ndikamuramba ndasarandeka mukanditi hana rubatsiro hapana chimwe chanonditira ndivo baba vevana ndozviita seiko ndozvikona seiko hapana ini ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ini ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ndivo baba vevana ndozviita seiko ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ndivo baba vevana ndozviita seiko ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate. Patakasangana tiri vaviri manga musipo tichiwirirana. Patakasangana tiri vaviri manga musipo tichiwirirana. Nasi zvinhu zvorema hapana munhu anondibatsira. Nasi zvinhu zvorema hapana munhu anondibatsira. Ini ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ini ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate here ndapanda hapana ini ndoita seiko kama una mate iyo mari yevana kuchikoro hapana ini ndoita seiko kama una mate choona hapana hapana ini ndoita seiko kama una mate ini ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate anditi ndimurambe ndikamuramba ndazara ndega kama una mate anditi ndimurambe ndikamuramba ndazara ndega kama una mate ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate here ndapana hapana ini ndoita seiko kama una mate yevana kuchikoro hapana ndoita seiko kama una mate ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate ndoita seiko hapana ini ndozvikona seiko kama una mate takasangana tiri vaviri manga musipo tichiwirirana.